Welcome to All Things Women's Health. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Stroud. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist of some 30 years. I'm a husband, a father, a grandfather, a small business owner. I'm a lot of things. But right now, I'm your host as we talk about really all things women's health. And it's everything from menstrual issues to mammograms, from personal trainers to homeschool curriculums. It doesn't matter. If it affects women and their health, it's on our agenda. And always from an authentically Christian Catholic perspective. And today's episode maybe is somewhat different. Different in the sense that we don't have a guest. It's just me. But I wanted to get in front of you with what I feel like is a very important story that has really just started to come to light. And it's a topic that came up that I really just noticed this weekend. And it involves the deaths of two women. The deaths actually occurred in 2022, but have just really now started to make their way into the news cycle. And it involves two women in the state of Georgia that died from complications of medical abortions. And that's actually not the focus of the news story. Rather, it's a presumed or an assumed connection of the women's deaths to a Georgia law which severely restricts access to abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy. Now, this episode is not actually intended to speak on the evils of abortion. Don't get me wrong, I would love to, and I suspect at some point soon I will do an entire episode dedicated just to that. But this is really about misinformation and poor medical reporting that appears to be intentionally designed to mislead. I noticed a few mentions of the story, I think maybe a few weeks ago, but honestly, I didn't pay that much attention to it. That is until just recently. Yesterday, actually, I noticed a friend and colleague from right here in Fort Wayne, Dr. Christina Francis. She's the president of the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, an organization that one would think shouldn't have to exist, but they do, and it's an amazing organization. But at any rate, she was interviewed on a weekend edition of Fox News about these cases. And Dr. Francis pointed out in the interview that these deaths were caused by two things: the legal use of these legal medications, one, and two, medical negligence. But as part of that reporting, mention was made about the national reporting and what appears to be now a hot topic for presidential candidate Vice President Harris, with numerous online resources and references talking about the Georgia ban on abortion and the need to improve so-called reproductive rights. Now, Georgia is a political battleground state in the upcoming presidential election. Both candidates see it as absolutely critical to win in November. So it's probably no coincidence that the story, because it relates to Georgia, has gotten so much coverage. So I went on a deep dive and spent far too much time paging through the internet posts and to YouTube posts and a whole host of other media options. And to the best of my ability to tell, Fox News is the only news organization that actually reported this unique aspect of the story. That's to say, the false medical reporting. Now, please, I wouldn't consider myself a huge fan of Fox News. I wouldn't really even call myself a regular viewer. But every other news organization, PBS, MSNBC, The Washington Post, ABC, CBS, NBC, that's just a few. They reported on the story in an almost identical way, with very clear allegations that the deaths were a direct cause of the restrictions placed on abortion by the state of Georgia. Why is this? Why would effectively every news organization, as well as now a presidential candidate, why would they be promoting this false narrative and doing so really in perfect agreement, perfect alignment, if you will? We'll get back to that a little bit later. So before I get into the details of the story and the two deaths themselves, I wanted to pause for just a minute and talk about the two medications used in so-called chemical abortions. Now, traditional abortions have been performed with a procedure known as a D&C. It is possible to have an abortion that doesn't require the surgical procedure using these two medications. The names are complicated, and I find there's a lot of confusion about them. The first drug is called mifepristone. Strange name. That's Mifepristone. It's sometimes called Mifeprix, or originally it was referred to as RU486. This drug is what's known as an anti-progesterone. So progesterone is required to maintain a pregnancy, absolutely required. So by blocking progesterone with this drug, the pregnancy is lost. That is to say, the baby dies. So the woman takes this pill first, and then 24 to 48 hours later, a second misoprostol, that's Misoprostol, much more commonly called Cytotec, Cytotec. That second medication is given. Both of these are in pill form. The Cytotec causes the woman's cervix to soften and to begin to open, and it causes the uterus to contract, expelling the then dead baby, completing the abortion. So for clarity, misoprostol or Cytotec has many, many other uses that have nothing to do with abortion. These include things like preventing gastric ulcers, and we even use it in obstetrics routinely to induce labor in a healthy pregnancy. So within a few hours of taking the second medication, the woman will typically begin to experience intense cramping, potentially very heavy bleeding. Most of the news organizations, interestingly, reporting on this story pointed out or stated that complications from the use of these medications is exceedingly rare. In fact, that phrase was used over and over, exceedingly rare. Well, that didn't fit with my experience as a 30-year practicing obstetrician gynecologist, so I did a little digging. And I found a really interesting research study that was published in a journal that's very important in my specialty. It's known as the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And it reported on an analysis of more than 40,000 abortions in Finland from the year 2000 to 2006. 40,000 abortions. This is a huge study. And that study found that 1 in 5 women undergoing chemical abortions actually experience complications. That's 4 times more than the number of women who experience complications from traditional surgical abortions. I find that to be something less than exceedingly rare, as it was quoted in all of the news studies. Now, the fact that chemical abortions with these medications require much less, or maybe no in some cases, healthcare provider supervision, I feel certain has something to do with why that complication rate is so much higher than that with traditional abortions. So what happened in these Georgia cases? And again, let's keep in mind, complications with these medications is not exceedingly rare, as we just pointed out with that study in Finland. So the first of the 2 deaths tragically involved a woman named Amber Thurman, and she legally obtained the abortion pills in a North Carolina clinic. She left Georgia, she traveled to North Carolina to obtain the pills. Unknowingly, she was actually pregnant with twins. That's important. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Days later, after returning to Georgia, as predicted, she began to abort the babies, as expected. But she began to develop some pretty troubling symptoms that concerned her, rightfully, so she went to a Georgia hospital. She was admitted by that hospital to the emergency room, and physicians monitored her status. They monitored it for another 20 hours. At that point, they decided to do a D&C, which is what she needed upon arrival, but she died during the procedure. She died from what's known as sepsis, or widespread, really total body infection. Now, the state of Georgia, like every state, has review boards that review certain kinds of deaths. Among them are maternal deaths. So the Georgia Review Board found 2 important findings. 1, Amber's death was preventable, and 2, it was directly related to the delay in receiving the care that she needed, in this case, the D&C. So that's important. It was both preventable and it was caused by a delay in care. The second case involved a woman named Candy Miller. She was a 41-year-old mother of three, and she herself had several rather complicated medical conditions, including lupus, among others, and her physicians reportedly advised her against future pregnancies, saying they could be unsafe. She reportedly obtained the abortion medications online, not from a provider, and she is said to have intentionally avoided interacting with physicians, made easier by the access measures that we'll talk about more in a minute. These are measures that no longer require healthcare provider involvement, like an ultrasound or a physical exam or anything like that. Those things were really the standard of care for the use of medical abortions only just a few years ago. Again, we'll get back to that. Now, sadly, Candy's teenage son watched her experience days and days of severe pain, bedridden. And on November 13th, 2022, her husband discovered her dead in her bed with her 3-year-old actually lying next to her. An autopsy confirmed that she had what's known retained products of conception. That is to say, the chemical abortion was not complete, and that parts of her aborted baby remained inside of her uterus. Probably equally, if not more importantly, it was determined that she had a lethal combination of painkillers, including fentanyl, in her system that were probably directly responsible for her death, presumably to combat the intense pain that she experienced. Of note, these medications were not prescribed by a physician, at least as far as that can be determined. Now, it's being widely reported and referenced over the last 2 days, as I mentioned earlier, by Vice President Harris, that the restrictive abortion laws in Georgia passed in the wake of the overturn of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court, those restrictions were directly responsible for these women's deaths. Now, the review board in the state of Georgia didn't say that, but that's what all of the news studies are reporting. The narrative, as reported, as I mentioned, by really every news organization in existence, has really been along these lines. The Georgia abortion ban is very restrictive. A physician, in fact, could go to prison for performing an abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy, that the law is worded poorly and in such a way that there's widespread confusion among physicians, and they're paralyzed with fear, unsure how to proceed in cases like these. So the confusion and the fear on the part of the physicians specifically called out, at least in this narrative, it's being called out, as the cause of Amber Thurman, specifically her death, because she was observed for 20 hours in the hospital. Here's a few critical points, interestingly, perhaps, that have been left out of the media's reporting. Amber Thurman was unknowingly pregnant with twins. I mentioned that earlier. The abortion pills are not to be used in this setting. If she'd been under the care of a competent healthcare provider, very likely an ultrasound would have been performed, discovering this important fact. And in fact, just until a few years ago, this safety step was required. But the FDA, in its wisdom, removed this and really all of the other safety requirements under the guise of improving access to abortion. Another point. When Amber presented to the hospital in Georgia, she was experiencing very clear signs and symptoms of what is called sepsis, or widespread infection throughout the body. This was caused by the retention of fetal tissue within the uterus. Notice I said fetal tissue, not live babies. Nothing in the Georgia law would prevent or prohibit a physician from performing a D&C in the setting of retained products of conception, as it's known in medicine. These babies were not alive. This is not an abortion of a live child. Nothing in the Georgia law would have prevented that. At that point, with dead tissue, dead fetal tissue within her uterus, it should have been treated as what is known as an incomplete miscarriage. That's a common occurrence in pregnancy care and the practice of obstetrics. The only thing that prevented the physicians from acting appropriately is professional incompetence, not the Georgia law. In the case of Candy Miller, she chose to take these medications completely without medical oversight, despite having several serious medical conditions herself. But I wouldn't for a moment blame her for that. Planned Parenthood and its partners in advocating for abortion have flooded the airways and the internet with information about the safety, the absolute safety of these medications. In fact, in almost every state that's attempted to require healthcare provider involvement in medical abortions, the abortion industry has claimed this type of oversight and involvement is completely unnecessary, and in fact, it's nothing but an obstacle to women receiving the care they needed. Even the FDA endorsed this concept a few years ago by removing almost all of the previous restrictions on the dispensing of this medication. And I have to say, that was a decision that was made by the FDA under the Biden-Harris administration. Miss Miller's pain was so intense that she took illegally obtained, presumably, narcotic pain medicines, including fentanyl, to try and address her pain. I have to question, was she informed by her online resource for these abortion medicines that her pain would be potentially that severe? Or were the signs and symptoms of a complication needing evaluation by a healthcare professional, were those reviewed with her? Those warnings are not required, at least not any longer, thanks to our friends at the FDA. These deaths could have been avoided, both of them. But the cause of these deaths, the cause of these women's deaths, had nothing to do with the Georgia abortion laws. That's just very clear. Why then would all of the news organizations be driving this narrative? Sadly, I think the answer is relatively simple. There is an overwhelming desire to show that the overturning of Roe versus Wade by the U.S. Supreme Court has led to such restrictions being placed on abortion that women are being harmed as a result of this. This is an old argument. This is the women will die if we don't make abortion readily available argument. That's been used for generations to justify abortion on demand. That's why this narrative is being pushed so uniformly and so passionately. What I find most troubling about this situation, though, is, in addition to obviously the preventable sad deaths, is the misleading reporting. Now, I get it. As Americans, we disagree to some degree over abortion. Should it be available? Should it be available at all times during a pregnancy? Should there be restrictions or limitations placed on abortion as a function of the gestational age of the pregnancy? Should there be exceptions to whatever restrictions might be in place to protect the life of the mother? Should there be exceptions in cases of rape and incest? Again, I get it. These are important questions, and they're questions that need to be openly discussed and debated. But these and all of the questions surrounding abortion need to be discussed and debated openly and honestly and factually so that we could come to a decision as a society that reflects our society's views and values. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be flooded by a powerful media industrial complex with an agenda that has nothing to do with honest, transparent debate. The story and stories like it, and the unprofessional, negligent reporting that go along with it are part of a powerful campaign to drive abortion. In this case, 5 innocent lives were lost, and lost for no reason. When death is the answer to a major societal evil, it would seem to me that something has gone terribly wrong. Death just can't be the answer to the problems these women or other women face. Women deserve so much more than abortion. I wouldn't for a moment, because I don't feel qualified, begin to try and tell you how to vote in the upcoming presidential election. That's not my role. I would try to convince you to take your vote seriously. Your vote actually matters. I would ask you to consider putting aside the labels, the rhetoric, the catchy phrases, the political parties, the billboards, and ask yourself if women deserve more than abortion, and vote your conscience. And remember, a decision to stay home and not vote because of your dislike for maybe both of the candidates is actually a vote for one of the other candidates, depending on the state in which you live. We are created in the image and likeness of an all-knowing and loving God. We are not God. I pray that those in positions of temporary power will come to recognize and respect life, all life, from conception to natural death. And I hope you'll cast your vote in a way that's consistent with that realization. So I hope you found this discussion helpful to some degree. I feel certain that I have probably offended some with my positions. If nothing else, I hope that when you hear medical reporting on women's health, that maybe you'll not necessarily take those reports at face value and instead do as I did in this case, dig a little deeper, looking for the truth. I pledge to keep doing my best to bring you factual information about all things women's health. Thank you for joining us. I hope that you'll plan to come back and see more episodes of All Things Women's Health. I'll be back soon with another edition. I hope that you'll like and subscribe, and I would ask that you share this with everybody you know. All of our episodes are available on our website, fertilityandmidwifery.com. They're available on our YouTube channel. If you search All Things Women's Health in the YouTube search, you'll find all of these episodes there. We also cross-post them on Instagram and on Facebook. So please check them out, share them with a friend, and join us again for another episode of All Things Women's Health. I'm Dr. Chris Stroud.